The two murders on the same night in two cities. A Sherlock Holmes story. Chapter 1. The night that split in two. There are nights in London when the fog does not merely settle upon the streets, but swallows them whole. When Baker Street itself becomes a thing of imagination, reduced to the amber suggestion of gas lamps and the muffled percussion of horses somewhere unseen. It was on such a night, the 14th of November in the year 1896, that two men died. One in a narrow house on Marylebone Lane, and one in a boarding room above a chandler's shop in Edinburgh. The police of neither city knew at the time that the other murder had occurred, and perhaps that is precisely what the killer had intended. I had spent the early part of that evening at my consulting rooms in Kensington, attending to a patient whose rheumatic complaint required considerably more patience than medicine. By the time I arrived back at Baker Street, the clock on the mantelpiece showed 9:30, and Holmes was in the posture I'd come to recognise as his thinking attitude. Recumbent upon the sofa, one leg dangling, his violin balanced against his chest in an attitude not of playing but of contemplation, the bow resting across his stomach like the baton of a tired conductor. "You have had a disagreeable consultation this evening," he said, without raising his eyes. "I have indeed," I admitted, settling into my armchair and reaching for the evening paper. "Mrs. Caldecott again. The woman refuses to follow any prescription she does not first argue against for 20 minutes. But I confess I do not know how you could possibly— The chalk dust on your left cuff," he said. "You lean against the wall of your waiting room only when you are fatigued enough to forget yourself. You're never fatigued after pleasant consultations. Ergo." He turned his head slightly. "What does the Standard say about the Marylebone business?" I had not yet opened the paper. "What Marylebone business?" "The one on page 3. I would have read it myself, but I find that the act of folding a newspaper requires more optimism about the news than I currently possess." I turned to the third page and found, in modest type beneath a story about parliamentary procedure, a brief notice that arrested my attention entirely. "Gentleman found dead in Marylebone. Mr. Aldous Pembridge, 54, a retired surveyor of Pembridge and Vane Associates, was found deceased at his home at No. 14 Caldwell Terrace, Marylebone, on the evening of November 14th. Inspector Gareth Lestrade of Scotland Yard has confirmed that the circumstances are being treated as suspicious. Mr. Pembridge is survived by a sister, Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth of Bath. A reward is offered for information leading to the identification of any person connected to this tragedy." "Pembridge," I read aloud. "A retired surveyor found dead this evening. Lestrade is on it, apparently." "And presumably has already arrested the wrong man," Holmes murmured pleasantly. "Though I grant him the evening. He's usually 3 hours before he does that." I set the paper down. "You knew about this?" "I knew about half of it." He sat up with sudden energy, placing the violin on the cushion beside him with the careful affection he showed toward few living things. "A telegram arrived at 6 o'clock. I confess I was expecting a second." He glanced toward the mantelpiece where I now observed a folded yellow telegram rested against the clock. "That is from Edinburgh. A man named Bartholomew Finch was found dead in his boarding room on the Canongate this morning. A postal clerk, retired, 61 years old. The Edinburgh police are handling it as a probable accident. He had a heart complaint of some standing." Holmes paused. He did not die of his heart. I stared at him. "You are suggesting these two deaths are connected, London and Edinburgh, on the same night, on the same evening, within 2 hours of one another, if the respective times reported are accurate." Holmes rose and stood before the fire, his long hands clasped behind his back, his grey eyes bright with the particular cold excitement that a complicated case ignited in him. Both men were of similar age, both retired, both, if my preliminary inquiries are correct, former employees of the same firm, a surveying and property mapping company that ceased operations some 15 years ago. He turned to me. "And both were killed by a dose of foxglove extract introduced, I strongly suspect, into their evening beverages." The room was very quiet. Outside, a hansom rattled past and the fog swirled briefly at the window. "Good Lord," I said at last. "Precisely." Holmes reached for his pipe. "The question, Watson, is not who killed them. That I rather think I already know. The question is why those two men, on that particular night, and what they knew, or what they possessed, that made their deaths necessary at the same hour in two separate cities." He struck a match. "I expect Lestrade before midnight. Shall I have Mrs. Hudson send up more coal?" In all my years at Baker Street, I'd rarely seen Holmes so immediately engaged by a case before the details were even in hand. But there was something in the geometry of it, the cold symmetry of two deaths, two cities, one night, that I could see had pierced through his usual reserve and kindled in him something approaching genuine agitation. He paced before the fire with short, precise steps, and his pipe did not draw evenly, which told me more about the state of his nerves than any confession could have done. 20 minutes later, the bell rang below, and the irregular but familiar tread of Inspector Lestrade sounded on the stairs. Chapter 2. Lestrade brings his certainties. Lestrade entered in a gust of November damp, his wiry frame hunched inside a coat that had seen better seasons, his dark eyes carrying the harried competence of a man who believes he has solved a problem while suspecting, uncomfortably, that he has not. He deposited his hat on the hook beside the door with the ease of long familiarity, and settled himself in the wooden chair near the door, never the armchair, which he seemed to regard with the same wariness a cavalry officer might reserve for unfamiliar terrain. "Evening, Mr. Holmes, Doctor." He drew a notebook from his inner pocket and held it in his lap with the posture of a man about to deliver a verdict. "I imagine you've seen the Standard." "Briefly," said Holmes. "Tell me about the room." "Number 14 Caldwell Terrace, a townhouse, 3 floors, owned by the deceased. Pembridge lived alone since his wife passed 4 years ago. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Dora Fretwell, discovered him at approximately 7 in the evening when he did not appear for his supper. She found him in his study on the first floor, slumped in his reading chair. His evening glass of port was on the table beside him, approximately half consumed. Lestrade paused significantly. The port glass was the only thing out of the ordinary. The room was otherwise undisturbed. "The only thing out of the ordinary to you," Holmes said pleasantly. He was standing at the window, his back to the room. "Go on." Lestrade's jaw tightened fractionally. The surgeon who attended confirmed that death appeared to be cardiac in nature. However, owing to the circumstances, and to a certain odour that the surgeon noted, we have ordered a full post-mortem examination. I expect the results by morning. He closed his notebook. "I have a suspect." "Of course you do." "A Mr. Clement Vane, son of the late partner of Pembridge's old firm, Pembridge and Vane Associates. Young Vane has been in dispute with Pembridge for 3 years over what he alleges is his father's share of the firm's assets which Pembridge retained upon dissolution of the partnership in 1881. There was a solicitor's letter exchanged as recently as last month. Vane was seen in the Marylebone area yesterday afternoon by 2 separate witnesses. He is a man of chemical knowledge, trained as an apothecary before abandoning that career." Lestrade spread his hands. "The circumstantial architecture is rather compelling, Mr. Holmes." "The circumstantial architecture," Holmes repeated, turning from the window, "is rather too compelling, which is why I find it suspicious. But tell me, Lestrade, have your colleagues in Edinburgh been in contact with you today?" The inspector frowned. "Edinburgh? No. Why would they be?" "Because a man named Bartholomew Finch died in Edinburgh this morning under circumstances that bear a remarkable resemblance to those surrounding Pembridge's death. Finch was 61, retired, formerly of the same firm as Pembridge." Holmes crossed to the mantelpiece and lifted the yellow telegram. "I received word from an Edinburgh acquaintance, Inspector Alistair Munro of the Edinburgh City Police, who was curious enough to wire me upon noticing the peculiar character of the death, though his colleagues have not yet treated it as suspicious." He handed Lestrade the telegram. Lestrade read it twice. The colour shifted slightly in his face. "The same firm," he said. "Pembridge and Vane Associates. Both men were surveyors, both retired. Both, according to what I've been able to determine in the past few hours, were involved in a specific project undertaken by that firm in the autumn of 1879, a land survey of a property in the Scottish borders." Holmes retrieved the telegram and set it back on the mantelpiece with care. "Now, Watson has been asking the obvious question, which is whether these deaths are connected. Your instinct, Lestrade, I observe, is telling you that they must be. And yet your Clement Vane theory, while tidy for London, does not explain Edinburgh. Unless Vane travelled, the Edinburgh death occurred at approximately 7 in the morning. The London death occurred between 5 and 7 in the evening. They are in different cities. The night mail takes 11 hours. It is not possible for a single person to have administered both poisons in person unless they departed Edinburgh before dawn and administered the London dose by early evening, a schedule that demands clockwork execution and considerable foreknowledge of both men's daily habits. Holmes paused. Possible, but strained. And Clement Vane, if your witnesses place him in Marylebone yesterday afternoon, was certainly in London. Which means either he did not administer the Edinburgh dose personally, or he is not the killer at all. Lestrade sat very still with the expression of a man who has watched a reasonably pleasant house develop an unexpected crack in the foundation. There is a third possibility, I ventured. Holmes looked at me with the slight elevation of the brow that signified polite interest. 2 killers, I said, working together. Ah, said Holmes. He picked up his pipe. Now Watson earns his supper. He said it without mockery, and I understood him to mean that he had already considered this possibility, and found it worthy of serious investigation. 2 killers, 1 purpose, simultaneous execution on the same night. That argues not merely shared motive, but careful coordination. And that, gentlemen, implies that this is not a crime of passion or opportunism. Someone has been planning this for a considerable time. Lestrade had recovered his composure and was writing in his notebook. I shall wire Edinburgh first thing in the morning. Wire them tonight, Holmes said quietly, and ask Monroe to preserve the boarding room exactly as it was found. I intend to travel to Edinburgh on the morning express. He turned to me. Will you come, Watson? I had already risen from my chair to begin thinking about what to pack. Chapter 3. What the surveyor's papers knew. Before we departed for Edinburgh, however, Holmes spent the whole of the following morning at Caldwell Terrace, and I had the privilege of accompanying him through what proved to be a masterclass in the art of reading a room. Mrs. Dora Fretwell, the housekeeper, was a stout and tearful woman of 60, who had served Aldous Pembridge for 11 years, and regarded his death with the combined grief of a loyal servant and the practical indignation of a woman who had prepared his supper and now had nowhere particular to go. She received us in the kitchen, which she had evidently made her refuge, and answered Holmes's questions with admirable precision. Once he had displayed the particular quality of patient attention that he reserved, I had noticed for servants, children, and station masters, people whose observations were precise because their livelihoods depended upon precision. Mr. Pembridge was expecting a visitor that afternoon, she said, turning her teacup in her hands. A lady. He told me there would be no need for a formal tea, just the port decanter set out in the study. He said she was an old acquaintance. Holmes did not visibly react, but I saw his fingers pause fractionally in the act of lighting his pipe. Did she arrive? I believe so, sir. I was below stairs from about 3:30. I heard the bell at perhaps 4 o'clock and footsteps above me, and later, perhaps 20 minutes later, I heard the front door again. I presumed she had left. You did not see her? No, sir. The bell rings to the door upstairs. Mr. Pembridge preferred to answer his own door when he was expecting a known visitor. I had no cause to go up. And the port decanter, was it already in the study when you last went upstairs? Yes, sir, I set it out at 2:30 as Mr. Pembridge instructed. Did Mr. Pembridge pour his own port typically? Mrs. Fretwell considered. He did, yes. Sometimes he would have me bring up a tray, but when he wanted privacy with his guests, he preferred to manage himself. Holmes thanked her with a warmth that I recognized as genuine rather than performative. He had what he needed. He made his way upstairs to the study, and I followed. The study at Caldwell Terrace was the room of a man of orderly habits and private enthusiasms. 2 walls were shelved with books, predominantly on surveying and cartography, a few volumes of poetry arranged with the slightly self-conscious neatness of a man who read poetry but did not wish to appear to. A large mahogany desk dominated the centre of the room, its surface arranged with a correspondence tray, an inkstand and a glass paperweight, within which a small blue flower had been preserved. The reading chair where Pembridge had been found stood near the fireplace, beside a small table on which Lestrade's men had left a chalk circle around the port glass's former position. The glass itself had been removed for analysis. Holmes moved through the room with the slow, drifting attention of a man reading an unfamiliar text, touching nothing yet, simply absorbing. He crouched to examine the hearthrug. He stood and studied the bookshelves. He crossed to the desk and bent low to examine the surface without touching it. The second drawer on the left has been opened recently, he said. I looked. I could see nothing particular about it. How can you tell? The brass handle bears a fresh smudge on its underside that is inconsistent with the patina of the others. Someone gripped it hurriedly, wearing gloves perhaps, or with damp fingers. Also the drawer is not quite closed to its natural stopping point. Pembridge was a meticulous man. Observe the symmetry of everything on this desk. He would not have left a drawer ajar. Holmes produced his handkerchief, used it to draw the drawer fully open, and peered inside. It contained several folded documents, a small leather-bound notebook, and, conspicuously, a rectangular depression in the dust at the back of the drawer where something had rested for a long time and had recently been removed. Something was taken, Holmes said. A flat document, perhaps a map or a large folded paper. The dimensions of the empty space suggest approximately 14 by 20 inches when folded. He straightened. A surveying plan, Watson, the appropriate size for a property map. The border property? The one surveyed in 1879? That is my hypothesis. He turned to the bookshelves and began examining the spines with quick, light attention. Pembridge kept his professional records here. I observed several bound volumes of survey notes. The year 1879 is represented by 2 volumes. The second one, however, he tilted his head slightly, has been replaced slightly out of sequence. It sits between 1877 and 1878, rather than between 1878 and 1880. Someone removed it, consulted it, and replaced it carelessly. I watched Holmes lift the volume carefully. It was a thick ledger-style book, the spine labelled Survey Records, P and V Associates, 1879 to 1880, and leafed through it with the rapid, expert attention of a man accustomed to reading professional documents at speed. He stopped about 2/3 of the way through and held the book at an angle to catch the grey morning light from the window. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is it?" A page has been cut out, cleanly, at the binding. Someone used a blade with some precision. The entry immediately before refers to the Glendarroch Survey, November 1879 Borders Commission. The entry immediately after refers to a different job entirely, dated February 1880. He closed the book. The Glendarroch Survey record has been removed. The visitor removed both the survey plan and the written record of it. He set the volume back with care. She knew exactly what she was looking for. I noted the pronoun. "You're certain the visitor was a woman?" Mrs. Fretwell described the sound of the door and the footsteps in the hallway. She said footsteps, and then she used the word she without self-correction, which means it was not an assumption she had formed, but a fact she knew. Holmes paused. Also, there is a faint impression in the hearthrug near the reading chair, a heel of unusual narrowness, a woman's boot, pointed toe, medium heel. She stood at that position for some time. We stood in Pembridge's study, and the weight of what had been taken hung in the air between us. A survey of a border property conducted in 1879 for which 2 men had now died. Whatever secret Glendarroch held had been buried for 17 years, and someone had decided with tremendous finality that it should remain buried. Chapter 4. The Cannon Gate in November. The morning express from King's Cross carried us northward through the pale grey landscape of November England, through the flat Midlands and up into the increasing bleakness of Yorkshire and beyond, until the light had the particular quality of Scottish winter, sharp and honest, and without the metropolitan romance of London fog. Holmes spent most of the journey in silence, his cheek against his knuckle, his eyes on the passing fields without appearing to see them. I read my medical journals and occasionally attempted conversation, which he tolerated with the polite inattention of a man whose mind was moving at a speed his body refused to match. We arrived at Waverley Station as the afternoon light was already failing, the castle high on its rock above us in the grey air, and were met on the platform by a compact, red-faced man in a good tweed coat, whose handshake conveyed the vigorous directness that I had come to associate with the Scottish professional classes. "Inspector Munro," said Holmes, returning the handshake with equal directness. "Your wire was admirably concise. I appreciate concision in official correspondence. It suggests a mind that knows what it knows." Munro's eyes moved briefly to me with the look of a man calibrating whether this was a compliment. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, the room is as I found it. I put a constable on the door last night after I received your man Lestrade's wire. My sergeant thinks I am being overcautious. He believes Finch had a heart attack." "Your sergeant," said Holmes pleasantly, "has probably never been to London." We rode in Munro's cab through the narrow, windy streets of Edinburgh's Old Town, up and over the ridge of the Royal Mile and down into the Cannon Gate, where the buildings pressed together with the ancient intimacy of a city built on rock with nowhere to expand but upward. Finch's boarding house was a 4-storey stone building of undistinguished character, its ground floor occupied by the chandler's shop whose smell of tallow and beeswax permeated the staircase above it. The room itself was small, low-ceilinged, and told the story of a man who had lived modestly and alone. A narrow bed, a writing table, a single armchair with a worn antimacassar, a wardrobe that was 3/4 empty. On the table, a Bible and a teapot, and a single cup. The teapot was the relevant article. The residue in the cup, when Holmes bent close and applied his nose, caused him to straighten with the immediate bright attention that meant confirmation rather than discovery. "The same agent," he said. "Digitalis. Foxglove extract. A significant dose. Enough to stop a heart that was already compromised." He glanced at Munro. "You said Finch had a cardiac condition?" "Since 1890, according to his physician here, Dr. Murdoch on the High Street. saw Finch monthly. Which means, Holmes said, settling into the armchair and surveying the room from that vantage, that whoever arranged his death knew of the condition, understood that a post-mortem might attribute the cause to natural cardiac failure without particular scrutiny, and calculated accordingly. They gave him a dose large enough to be certain but not so outrageous as to make external administration obvious without careful examination. He turned to look at the window, which faced a narrow close and admitted thin grey light. And they did so from outside. Finch did not have a visitor. This arrested both Munro and me simultaneously. "You are certain?" Munro said. "The room shows no evidence of a visitor. 1 cup, not 2. The armchair has not been moved. Observe the slight impressions in the floorboards where its legs habitually rest. They are undisturbed, meaning no one shifted it to add a second chair or to make space for another person to stand comfortably. The bed has not been sat upon. There is no second glass, no second teacup, no suggestion of hospitality extended." Holmes leaned forward, elbows on knees. "And yet Finch drank his tea. He drank it in the normal way, in his own chair, and died within an hour of doing so." He paused. "The poison was not in the cup. It was in the tea itself, introduced before the tea reached Finch." I considered this. "In the teapot?" "The teapot is a possibility, but Finch purchased his tea from a shop and brewed it himself each morning, according to his landlady. The more elegant solution—" Holmes rose and crossed to the writing table where a small tin tea caddy sat beside the teapot. "Is this." He examined the caddy lid without touching it. The lid bears a faint scratch near the hinge that was not there originally. The original scratch pattern from opening is different. Someone opened this recently with a tool or with an instrument not intended for the purpose. A small quantity of foxglove tincture introduced into the tea leaves would dissolve entirely and release its active compounds upon brewing. He straightened. The poisoner never entered this room. They came at a time when Finch was absent, possibly when he was at his physician's appointment, which was, if regular, likely the morning before, and tampered with the caddy. Munro swore under his breath with considerable economy. So we have a killer who planned this days in advance. Not days, weeks, at minimum. The London death was administered by a person who visited Pembridge directly, a woman. The Edinburgh death was arranged remotely, through a timed mechanism, as it were. A poisoned supply that would produce death on whichever morning Finch next brewed his tea. Holmes moved to the wardrobe and opened it. Inside, neatly folded, were the modest possessions of a quiet man. 2 suits, 3 shirts, several pairs of socks, a box of personal papers on the shelf above. Holmes lifted the box down and set it on the bed. The papers were the usual accumulation of a retired man's life. Old receipts, a few letters from family and Fife, a pension document, and at the bottom, a sealed envelope addressed in Finch's own hand with a single word, "Insurance." Holmes turned the envelope over in his hands. It had been sealed with red wax, not merely with gum, which spoke of deliberate formality. "Finch was afraid," Holmes said quietly. "He prepared this as protection, and it did not protect him." He set the envelope down carefully. "We should open this in the presence of a solicitor. It may be evidence." He turned to Munro. "I should like to speak with Finch's physician tomorrow morning, and I should like to know the names of any persons who called upon Finch or inquired after him in the past 6 weeks." As we descended the staircase, the smell of candles and wax all around us, I found myself thinking of Pembridge's study, the cut page, the missing map, and of this sealed envelope with its single, bleak word. 2 old men, both frightened, both trying in their different ways to prepare for a threat they had perhaps been expecting for years. Whatever they knew about Glendorock, they had known it was dangerous, and they had not been wrong. Chapter 5. The Woman in the Visitor's Book. Edinburgh opened itself to Holmes the following morning with the methodical cooperation of a city that takes its civic record-keeping seriously. While I attended the post-mortem examination with Dr. Murdoch, a preliminary toxicological screen conducted with the admirable directness of the Scottish medical profession, which confirmed the presence of cardiac glycosides in Finch's organ tissue, Holmes spent 3 hours in the company of Finch's physician, his landlady, and the proprietress of the tea shop on the high street where Finch purchased his supplies. We reconvened over lunch at our hotel, and Holmes was in the energised, crackling state that I associated with a case beginning to cohere. "The tea shop," he said, placing a small piece of bread on his plate and apparently forgetting it. Finch purchased his tea, a Ceylon blend of the standard type, from Mrs. Gillespie's establishment on the last Tuesday of every month. He had done so for 6 years without variation. This regularity is documented in Mrs. Gillespie's account book, because Finch had a monthly credit account. Anyone who knew Finch's routine would know exactly when the new tin would be opened. And someone interfered with it before it reached him, I asked. No, more elegantly still, someone interfered with the existing tin in his room. Holmes sipped his coffee. Finch was last seen by his landlady, a Mrs. Agnes Craigie, on the morning of November 12th, 2 days before his death. She recalls the date because he commented that he had a physician's appointment that afternoon. That afternoon, while Finch was at Dr. Murdoch's surgery, someone entered his room. Mrs. Craigie allowed a visitor? She showed a visitor to the room, Holmes said carefully, believing the matter to be entirely legitimate. A woman presented herself at the front door that afternoon, bearing a small parcel and a note which she claimed was from Finch himself, asking her to leave the parcel in his room as he expected to be delayed. The note was handwritten, the handwriting a reasonable approximation of Finch's own. I compared a sample. Not a forgery executed by someone who had studied Finch's hand extensively, but a competent imitation. Good enough to satisfy a landlady with no reason to be suspicious, he paused. Mrs. Craigie showed the woman upstairs, left her for perhaps 10 minutes, and escorted her out. She brought no parcel when she left. She left the parcel in the room, I said. She left nothing in the room that would be found, or rather she took something away. The parcel, whatever its stated contents, was merely the pretext for having something to carry both entering and leaving. She entered with an item that could conceal a small vial of tincture. She introduced the tincture into the tea caddy and left with the empty parcel. Holmes turned his coffee cup. The parcel itself was probably an innocuous thing, a wrapped book perhaps, or a box of biscuits. Can Mrs. Craigie describe the woman? Admirably, Holmes produced his notebook. Approximately 35 to 40 years of age, tall for a woman, 5 feet and 7 or 8 inches, dark hair, well dressed in a manner suggesting comfortable but not extravagant means. Soft Edinburgh accent, which Mrs. Craigie found unremarkable. She wore grey. I set down my fork. The same woman who visited Pembridge in London. Almost certainly not in person. The times are incompatible. Pembridge's visitor came to London on the afternoon of November 14th. The Edinburgh poisoning was prepared on November 12th. She could have been in Edinburgh on the 12th and travelled to London in time for the 14th, Holmes considered. But there is an inconsistency. The London visitor wore a narrow-heeled boot suggesting London fashions of the current season. The Edinburgh woman, according to Mrs. Craigie, wore practical laced boots entirely suited to Edinburgh pavements. This may mean nothing. A woman who travels between cities might dress appropriately for each, or it may mean 2 women. 2 killers, I said, as I suggested. As you suggested. Holmes inclined his head. But whether they are 2 women, or 1 woman and 1 accomplice, or 2 people of different sexes acting in concert, I cannot yet say. What I can say is that both were operating with specific knowledge of the victim's habits, routines, and, crucially, of the significance of the Glendarroch survey. He set down his coffee cup and looked at me directly across the table, which suggests that the person directing these killings has access to the same information that Pembridge and Finch possessed. They knew about the survey, they knew about the property, and they knew that Pembridge and Finch were the last remaining witnesses to whatever was recorded there. In the afternoon, Munro arranged for us to meet with Finch's solicitor, a Mr. Alasdair Drummond of Drummond and Bell, who opened the sealed envelope in our presence. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in Finch's neat clerk's hand, undated. Should I meet with an unnatural end? I wish it known that in the autumn of 1879 I assisted in the survey of the Glendarroch estate, Roxburghshire, together with my employer, Mr. Aldous Pembridge, and the late Mr. George Vane. In the course of that survey, we discovered that the northern section of the estate, some 300 acres of land sold by the previous owner, Mr. James Halcrow, to the Earl of Brackenden in 1877, had been falsely mapped by the original conveyancing survey, placing the estate's northern boundary approximately 400 yards further than the actual ground truth warranted. The disputed acreage included a coal seam of significant commercial value. Mr. Halcrow sold without knowledge of this seam. The Earl acquired it at agricultural land prices. We were instructed by Mr. Vane, acting on instructions from the Earl, to record the false boundary in our official survey and certify it as accurate. Mr. Pembridge and I were paid £500 each. Mr. Vane received, I believe, considerably more. I have regretted this action every day since. I kept this record against the day it might become necessary. The room was very quiet. Through the solicitor's window, the castle sat on its rock in the grey afternoon, patient and indifferent. Fraud, I said, land fraud, on a considerable scale. And the motive, said Holmes, for 2 murders 17 years later. He stood. We need to know who now owns Glendarroch. Chapter 6. The Earl's Inheritance and a Living Daughter. The original Earl of Brackenden, Reginald Forsyth, 7th Earl, had died in 1888, leaving the entirety of the Glendarroch estate to his only surviving child, a daughter, Lady Evelyn Forsyth. Lady Evelyn, now 34, had since that time devoted herself to the estate with the focused intelligence of a woman who had received a first-class education and had no husband upon whom to spend it. She had repaired the estate's considerable debts, modernised its farming operations, and this was the detail that Holmes underlined with a pencil stroke when Munro's inquiries turned it up, had been in negotiations for the past 18 months with the Caledonian Coal and Mining Syndicate regarding prospecting rights on the northern section of the Glendarroch land. The coal seam, I said. The coal seam, Holmes agreed. If the land fraud of 1879 is exposed, the boundary reverts to its true position. The northern 300 acres return to Halcrow's heirs. The coal seam, which the syndicate has valued, according to a report in the Edinburgh Commercial Press last spring, at somewhere between £40,000 and £60,000, reverts with it. He set down the newspaper clipping Munro had obtained. Lady Evelyn Forsyth stands to lose a very great deal of money. Enough to kill for, Munro said with Scottish directness. The question, Holmes said, is whether she knew about the fraud. He leaned back and pressed his fingertips together. Her father committed it, or commissioned it to be precise. She was 17 in 1879. It is entirely possible she knew nothing until recently, when the coal negotiations brought the northern boundary under scrutiny and someone, perhaps her own solicitor, examining the original conveyancing, noticed an inconsistency between the 1877 and 1879 surveys. Or she has known for years, I said, and acted only when the commercial stakes became high enough to make the risk worth taking. Both possibilities remain open. Holmes stood and moved to the window of our hotel room, where the Edinburgh skyline presented its dramatic silhouette against the deepening afternoon. What is not open to question is the sequence of events as I now understand it. Someone, whether Lady Evelyn herself or a person acting for her, became aware that Pembridge and Finch were the surviving witnesses to the fraudulent survey. George Vane, the third party, died in 1884. His son Clement, yes, Watson, the very man Lestrade suspects in London, would have inherited whatever his father knew. Holmes turned. That is interesting, is it not? Clement Vane, whose father was the principal architect of the fraud, and who has been pursuing Pembridge legally over the firm's assets. What if Vane already knows about Glendarroch? What if his legal dispute with Pembridge is not merely about firm assets, but about specific information that his father possessed? This reframing of Clement Vane's position shifted something in my understanding of the case. You mean Vane might be working with Lady Evelyn? Or against her, Holmes said, or independently pursuing his own interests. He crossed the room and lifted his coat from the chair back. I intend to know Lady Evelyn Forsyth's movements on the 12th and 14th of November, and I intend before we return to London to know the exact contents of the Glendarroch title deeds as they currently stand. He paused at the door. Also, Watson, did Lestrade wire about the post-mortem results from London? I checked the small stack of telegrams that had accumulated on the writing table. Yes, this morning. The post-mortem confirms cardiac glycoside poisoning in Pembridge as well. The concentration was high, death within an hour of ingestion. Consistent with concentrated foxglove tincture in the port, Holmes nodded. And the port decanter? Clean. The poison was in the glass, not the decanter. The visitor poured the dose into Pembridge's glass directly, probably while his attention was elsewhere. Bold, Holmes said. She administered it in the same room as the victim. That argues either great nerve or great familiarity with him, a person whose presence at the drinks table would not have seemed remarkable. He was quiet for a moment. Pembridge admitted her willingly. He called her an old acquaintance. He let her manage the port. He frowned slightly. Who is she, Watson? That is the central question of the London half of this case. He opened the door. Come, Munro has arranged for us to take the afternoon train to Roxburghshire. I wish to see Glendarroch before the light goes entirely. We arrived at the small station of Kelso as the last of the afternoon sun dissolved behind the hills, and a hired trap carried us the 4 miles to the Glendarroch estate, through a landscape of extraordinary bleak beauty, wide moorland fading into dark, the first stars appearing in the east, the smell of peat and frost sharp in the air. The estate house itself was an imposing Jacobean structure set back from a gravel drive. its windows lit against the darkness with the warm authority of a well-managed household. Holmes had sent no advance notice. He had, on this point, been quite deliberate. "If Lady Evelyn is our quarry," he had said on the train, "then advance notice gives her time to prepare. If she is innocent, she will be surprised but cooperative. Either way, the unannounced visit tells me more than the expected one." The butler who answered the door was a composed man who managed the surprise of unexpected callers with professional grace, and after a brief interval, we were shown into a drawing-room of considerable elegance. Lady Evelyn Forsyth received us 10 minutes later. She was tall, the description fitted, with dark hair arranged simply and intelligent dark eyes that assessed us with no apparent discomposure. She was dressed in a plain dark gown without ornament, and she moved with the measured ease of a person accustomed to managing her own affairs. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I have been expecting someone to come. I confess I expected a policeman." She gestured toward the chairs. "Please sit down." Chapter 7. What Lady Evelyn did not say. There is a category of witness that Holmes found both useful and vexing in approximately equal measure. The intelligent, self-possessed woman who answers questions with perfect accuracy, while carefully managing the frame within which those answers are given. Lady Evelyn Forsyth belonged decisively to this category, and as Holmes conducted his examination, pleasantly, unhurriedly, with the quality of relaxed attention that he deployed when he wished his subject to believe they were in control of the conversation, I observed her with the interest of a man watching a well-matched game of chess. "You were expecting someone to come in connection with the deaths of Mr. Pembridge and Mr. Finch," Holmes began. "I was expecting that their deaths might lead to inquiries concerning my estate, yes." She sat without fidgeting, her hands quiet in her lap. When one's property is associated with a legal matter of long standing, one becomes attentive to developments. "You were aware of the nature of the fraud committed in 1879? "I was made aware of it in the spring of this year," she said, "by my solicitor, Mr. Hargreaves of Hargreaves and Cairns, Edinburgh. In the course of reviewing the boundary documentation for the coal negotiations, he identified a discrepancy between the original conveyancing survey of 1877 and the Pembridge and Vane survey of 1879. He brought this to my attention and advised me of its implications." A pause. "I will not pretend this was comfortable news, Mr. Holmes. My father committed, or commissioned, an act of fraud. The result of that fraud is that I currently hold title to land that does not, strictly speaking, belong to me." "What did you do with this information?" Holmes asked. "I instructed Mr. Hargreaves to investigate the extent of the discrepancy and to identify the surviving parties to the original survey. He determined that both Pembridge and Finch were alive, and that the third surveyor, George Vane, had died. He also determined that the Halcrow families to the original vendors had heirs, specifically a nephew, Mr. Duncan Halcrow of Melrose." She met Holmes's eyes directly. "My intention, Mr. Holmes, was to settle the matter privately, before the coal negotiations concluded, by coming to an arrangement with the Halcrow heirs that would compensate them appropriately for the land, at fair market value including the mineral rights, and by seeking some form of agreed resolution with Pembridge and Finch that would preserve the confidentiality of the arrangement." "A private settlement," Holmes said, "avoiding public exposure of the fraud." "Avoiding public embarrassment to my father's memory and to this estate, yes. I do not think that is an ignoble motivation." Her voice was steady, but carried a quality of careful constraint. "I was not motivated by financial self-interest. The coal seam is of significant value, but I would rather lose it than carry the weight of my father's dishonesty indefinitely. I had my solicitor draft letters to both Pembridge and Finch in September." "Did you receive replies?" A slight pause. "Pembridge replied through his own solicitor, indicating willingness to discuss the matter under certain conditions. Finch did not reply at all." "And did you travel to London in connection with this matter?" "I did, on 2 occasions, once in October, to meet with Mr. Hargreaves' London counterpart regarding the Halcrow title, and once," another pause, very slight, "on November 12th, briefly, returning on the 13th. I heard the date and controlled my expression. Holmes did not visibly react. "And during the visit of November 12th and 13th, he said pleasantly, "you did not travel to Edinburgh?" "No. You were in London throughout?" "I was in London on the evening of the 12th and the morning of the 13th. I returned by the afternoon express." She was watching Holmes with the calm of a person who has prepared for a question and finds its arrival merely confirms a preparation well made. "Lady Evelyn," Holmes said, with a shift of tone that was barely perceptible but which I had learned meant he was moving to a matter of central importance, "you have been admirably forthcoming about your knowledge of the fraud and your intentions regarding it. I appreciate this, but I must ask you directly. Did you, at any time, communicate to any person the names and addresses of Pembridge and Finch?" The pause this time was longer. In the fire, a coal settled with a soft sound. "I communicated their names to my solicitor," she said carefully, "as I had to for the purposes of the correspondence. And to anyone else? I discussed the matter with my estate manager, Mr. Gideon Larch, in general terms." "In general terms," Holmes repeated. "Did those general terms include the addresses of the two men?" Lady Evelyn looked at Holmes for a long moment. When she spoke, there was something new in her voice. Not fear exactly, but its near neighbour, a quality of awakening to an implication she had not fully considered. "Mr. Larch handles the correspondence files. He would have had access to the solicitor's letters, which contained those details." She paused. "You are suggesting—" "I am not yet suggesting anything," Holmes said. "I am gathering information." He rose. "I have two further questions. When were you last in Edinburgh before November 14th? "In October, the 18th. "And Mr. Larch? How long has he been in your employ?" "7 years. "Has he any family in Edinburgh?" A beat of silence. "A sister," said Lady Evelyn slowly. "A Mrs. Marion Prentice. She has been a widow these 3 years, I believe. I think she lives on the Royal Mile or near it." Holmes thanked her, bowed correctly, and led us out into the Roxburghshire night. In the trap back to the station, he said nothing for several minutes, and I did not disturb the silence, which had the quality of conclusion rather than vacancy. "Larch and his sister," I said at last. "Larch and his sister," Holmes confirmed. "He knew about the survey from the estate correspondence. He told his sister in Edinburgh, perhaps innocently, perhaps not. The sister knew Finch's address because Edinburgh is a smaller city than London, and a single woman of moderate means seeking a retired postal clerk in the Canongate could find him without great difficulty." Holmes looked at the passing dark of the moorland. "But why? What does Gideon Larch gain from protecting Lady Evelyn's estate at the cost of 2 lives? It was a question that would not answer itself that night. Chapter 8. The Errand Larch Did Not Take. We returned to London on the overnight express, arriving at King's Cross in the grey early morning of November 18th, and went directly to Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson, with the resigned competence of a woman long accustomed to irregular hours, had left a cold breakfast and 3 telegrams on the sitting-room table. One was from Lestrade, reporting that Clement Vane had been released. The circumstantial evidence, upon closer examination and in the light of the Edinburgh connection, having proven insufficient for charges. One was from Munro, confirming that Marion Prentice, née Larch, resided at 7 Thistle Close, Edinburgh, and had been absent from her lodging since November 15th. And one was from Holmes's own network of informants, an unsigned note in a handwriting I recognised as belonging to a young man named Peters, who ran errands for Holmes in the postal districts, informing him that a Mr. Gideon Larch, estate manager, had been observed at Charing Cross Station on the afternoon of November 13th, travelling apparently with a medium-sized trunk. "The afternoon of the 13th, I said, spreading cold toast with butter and trying to feel human after a night in a second-class sleeping compartment. "The day before the London murder, he was in London. He has not been reported at Glenderrick since November 12th, Holmes said, standing before the fire in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, his breakfast untouched. Lady Evelyn will have noticed his absence by now, and if she is as intelligent as she appears, she will already be asking herself certain questions." He turned to face me. "I think Lady Evelyn is telling the truth as she knows it, Watson. She intended a private settlement. She believed her solicitor and her estate manager were executing that intention. Instead, Larch, either on his own initiative or in concert with someone, decided that a private settlement was not sufficient protection and that the witnesses needed to be permanently silenced. But what is Larch's personal motive? I pressed. He is an estate manager. The coal seam enriches Lady Evelyn, not him. Holmes was quiet for a moment, staring at the fire. Then he crossed to his desk and began going through the accumulated papers, letters, clippings, the notes he had made during the investigation, with the quick, extractive efficiency of a man who knows what he is looking for. He stopped at a clipping from the Edinburgh Commercial Press, the same one Munro had supplied regarding the coal negotiations. "The Caledonian Coal and Mining Syndicate," he said. "I have been looking at this from Lady Evelyn's side. But the syndicate has its own interests in this land, and considerable capital already invested in the prospective agreement. If the Glenderrick title is challenged, and the northern boundary reverts, their entire project collapses." He set the clipping down. "Who are the principals of the Caledonian Coal and Mining Syndicate?" He had already begun making inquiries through his commercial contacts the previous evening, as it turned out, a fact revealed when a further messenger arrived at 9:30 with a response to a query Holmes had wired from Edinburgh. He read it, and his expression changed in the subtle way I had learned to interpret as the confirmation of a significant suspicion. The three principal investors in the Caledonian Coal and Mining Syndicate, he said, are a Mr. Thomas Alleyne of the City, a retired coal factor named Whitmore, and— he glanced at me with the particular look of one who produces a card that changes the game— a Mr. Gideon Larch, estate manager, currently of Glendarroch Estate, Roxburghshire, who holds a 1/4 share acquired in July of this year. I set down my cup. He has invested his own money. A man of modest wage who somehow acquired enough capital to purchase a 1/4 share of a mining venture by July of this year. I expect we will find on investigation that he has borrowed heavily against this investment. If the Glendarroch title fails, Gideon Larch is ruined. Holmes folded the message and placed it in his pocket. And if Pembridge and Finch were alive to testify to the fraud, which Lady Evelyn's solicitor's letters may have communicated to Larch through the correspondence files, then his investment, his financial future, and possibly his freedom all depended on their silence. So Lady Evelyn truly knew nothing of the murders. I believe she did not. She was pursuing a legitimate settlement. Larch read her intention as catastrophic for his own interest and acted unilaterally, using his sister as the Edinburgh agent and travelling to London himself to ensure the Pembridge half of the operation. Holmes paused, or vice versa. We do not yet know whether Larch visited Pembridge personally, or arranged that through another channel. The woman who visited Pembridge, I said. The narrow boot, the London fashion. That does not sound like Larch. No, it does not. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. There is someone else in this, a third actor in the London portion. Someone who knew Pembridge, whom he admitted without hesitation, whom he called an old acquaintance. He paused with his coat half on. I have been assuming this person served Larch's interests. But what if they served their own? What if the visit to Pembridge had a dual purpose? Retrieving the Glendarroch records on behalf of someone who needed them for reasons quite separate from covering a murder? I stared at him. You are suggesting the woman who poisoned Pembridge was not Larch's agent. I am suggesting, Holmes said carefully, straightening his coat, that she may have been Clement Vane's. Chapter 9. Mr. Vane receives a visit. He did not expect. Clement Vane lived in a set of chambers on Montague Street, close enough to the British Museum that he might easily have spent his evenings in scholarly pursuits, but sufficiently removed from Marylebone that his presence there, as reported by Lestrade's witnesses, required deliberate purpose rather than casual proximity. He was a man of 32, slight and dark, with the nervous quickness of a terrier and the wary intelligence of someone who has spent years in a legal dispute and has learned to assess every conversation for its evidential implications. He received us without pleasure but with composure, having apparently prepared himself for further interrogation since his release. Holmes settled in the offered chair and began with a pleasantry about the neighbourhood, a tactic I had observed him use when he wished to allow a subject to relax before introducing the matter he actually cared about. Vane relaxed fractionally. He was, I thought, a man carrying a considerable weight of anxiety, and not all of it was about Pembridge's death. Your legal dispute with Pembridge concerned the assets of the firm upon dissolution, Holmes began conversationally. The assets were distributed inequitably, Vane said. My father held an equal partnership. When the firm dissolved in 1881, Pembridge took the full value of the client contracts and the equipment. My father received his share of the outstanding debts. The old bitterness sat in his voice like a stain. Your father died in 1884, Holmes said. He had not, to your knowledge, made provision in his papers for any particular information related to a survey conducted in 1879. The slightest possible change in Vane's face. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Holmes said pleasantly. Your father was the principal executor of a fraudulent survey of the Glendarroch estate in Roxburghshire. He was paid for it, considerably more than the other two parties. When he died, he left papers. Men who possess dangerous information frequently leave records of it, either as insurance, as Finch did, or as inheritance, intending their heirs to make use of it at some future point. Holmes paused. I suspect your father wrote down what he knew about Glendarroch. I suspect you found this record, and I suspect that your legal dispute with Pembridge was, in part, a veiled attempt to arrive at an understanding with him about that information. Vane was still. Outside, a cart went past in the street, the horse's hooves deliberate and unhurried on the November cobbles. If I found such a record, Vane said carefully, it would represent a legal liability as much as an asset. Precisely why your father never acted on it, and why you have been careful about how you act on it. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Mr. Vane, I am not here to prosecute you for the possession of information. I am here because 2 men are dead, and you have knowledge that may be directly relevant to who killed them. I am asking you to choose, in the next few minutes, whether you wish to help identify the persons responsible, or whether you wish to protect information that, I assure you, will come to light regardless of your cooperation, because I already know the broad shape of it. Vane looked at Holmes for a long, calculating moment. Then he got up and went to the writing desk in the corner, opened the lower drawer and produced a leather wallet of documents which he set on the table between us. My father kept a memorandum, he said. I found it in 1888 when I settled his estate. He described the fraud in detail, including the payments. He also described a meeting, in 1880, at which the Earl of Brackenden's representative, not the Earl himself but his London agent, made a further payment and a threat. He sat down again. The threat was directed at all 3 surveyors. If any of them spoke of the matter, the agent said, they would be ruined, and he used a word that my father underlined twice. Vane paused. Destroyed. Who was the London agent? Holmes asked. A solicitor named Mortlake. Dead now. Died in 1893. Vane's mouth tightened, but he had a partner, still living, a Mr. Cornelius Barr, currently of Lincoln's Inn. Holmes was quite still. And did Cornelius Barr know the full details of the Glendarroch arrangement? If he was Mortlake's full partner, he would have. Vane looked at his hands. I had a letter from Barr 2 months ago. He asked me to cease my legal proceedings against Pembridge's estate. He said the matter was, I remember his exact phrase, best concluded privately among those who understand its sensitivity. He knew you knew, Holmes said. Yes, a beat. And 4 weeks ago, a woman came to my rooms. She said she was acting on behalf of a client who wished to purchase my father's memorandum outright for a sum of £500. She was very pleasant, very direct, very well dressed. Vane looked at Holmes steadily. She wore London fashions, her boots were pointed, narrow-heeled. The description landed with precise weight. You did not sell her the document, Holmes said. I told her I needed to consider. I was suspicious. £500 for a document of this nature seemed both too much and too little. He nodded toward the leather wallet. I kept it, as you see, and then Pembridge died, and I understood that the document I had been asked to sell was the only reason I was still alive to be asked. Holmes rose, and the quality of his movement, contained, purposeful, told me that the case had reached its axle. Do you know the name of this woman? He asked. She gave the name Mrs. Harlow. I don't believe it was her real name. Vane paused. But I have seen her since. Last week, from my window. She passed in the street below, in the company of a man of perhaps 50, stout, wearing a solicitor's bag. I recognised the bag because it bore a monogram, C.B. Cornelius Barr, Holmes said quietly. I thought so, yes. Holmes thanked him briefly, took the leather wallet under his arm with a request for its temporary use, and led me out into Montague Street. He walked very fast for the first 100 yards, then stopped at the corner and turned to face the direction we'd come from, his eyes bright and fixed on a middle distance that had nothing to do with the street in front of him. Barr, he said. He knew about the fraud from the beginning. He kept the secret for 17 years, and when Lady Evelyn's settlement threatened to expose it through the courts, potentially exposing Mortlake and Barr's original role in the suppression, he decided to act. Holmes began walking again rapidly. The woman is almost certainly a professional agent of some kind, not an amateur. She knows how to administer poison without visible distress. She moves between London and Edinburgh with ease, and she attempted to purchase the Vane document as calmly as if she were acquiring a painting. He turned a corner. She did not act alone. Larch provided the Edinburgh half. She executed the London half on Barr's instructions. Then we have 3 principal actors, I said, walking fast to keep pace. Barr, Larch, and this woman. And the question, Holmes said, is which of them knew the full picture, and which were acting in the dark. Chapter 10. Holmes lays a snare at Lincoln's Inn. For 3 days, Holmes was in the grip of that particular fever of preparation that I had come to recognise as his most dangerous phase. Not dangerous to himself, precisely, but to the person at whom his energies were directed. He sent telegrams in quantity. He visited, so far as I could determine from his absence and subsequent references, the Society of Conveyancing Solicitors, the Inns of Court Records Office, the Office of the Caledonian Coal and Mining Syndicate's London Solicitors, and a woman named Agnes Trowell in Bermondsey, whose function in Holmes's information network I had never been able to determine but whose contributions appeared to be significant. He also spent 6 hours in the reading room of the British Museum, which he visited with the focused appetite of a man who needed very specific things and knew where to find them. On the evening of November 21st, he laid out the shape of what he intended to do. Cornelius Barr is a careful man, Holmes said, standing at the mantelpiece in the amber light of the sitting room while I sat with my pipe. He has been careful for 30 years. He will not be moved by evidence alone. He will find a way to contest or suppress it, and he has the legal machinery to do so effectively. Larch is already gone. Monroe has not located him, and I suspect he's preparing to leave the country. The woman, I now know her real name, I believe, but that is a matter for the trap itself. He turned. I am going to write Barr a letter. Announcing yourself? Announcing that I am in possession of certain documents related to the Glendarroch survey, and that I wish to discuss their disposition privately and discreetly, as I understand the matter involves persons of standing, and I am anxious to avoid unnecessary damage to reputations. Holmes smiled, and it was the particular smile I had come to think of as his surgical one. Precise, impersonal, entirely without warmth. I shall intimate that I may be persuaded to manage these documents in a fashion that protects the interests of all parties. In short, I shall make myself appear to be inviting a bribe. I stared at him. And Barr will. Barr, if he believes the story, will send the woman. He will not come himself. He has been too careful for too long to expose himself to a direct meeting with a potential blackmailer. He will send her to assess the situation and, if possible, to deal with it, as she has dealt with other obstacles. Holmes paused. Lestrade will have 3 constables in the building. I will have you, Watson, and you will have your revolver. And you? I asked. I shall be present in the room, but not as Sherlock Holmes. He glanced at the box in the corner where he kept his theatrical materials. The letter will be signed by a Mr. Ambrose Ketch, retired solicitor's clerk, who operates from a modest office in Tooks Court, off Chancery Lane. I have let the office, paid the month's rent this afternoon, and told the landlord that I sometimes work irregular hours. He moved to the desk and began writing. Lestrade will need 48 hours' notice. I shall give him 36. The letter was sent the following morning. The reply, delivered by hand, not post, which told its own story, arrived within 4 hours and was brief. Mr. Ketch was invited to consider whether his proposed meeting might be conducted the following evening at a location of his choosing. The handwriting was a secretary's, neutral and professional. The envelope bore no return address. She is quick, Holmes said with professional admiration, and she is testing us. She wants to see the location we choose, whether it is a public space that limits her options, or a private space that increases her freedom of action. He looked up. We shall choose a middle ground, a private office in a public building, with exits that appear numerous but are in fact controlled. On the evening of November 23rd, I sat in a small anteroom off the main office of the premises at Tooks Court, my service revolver in my jacket pocket, listening to the sounds of the building settling into its evening quiet. Lestrade and his men were variously positioned, 2 in the street below, 1 on the landing outside. I'd seen Holmes disappear into the main office 40 minutes earlier in a costume I struggled to reconcile with the man I knew. Stooped, grey-haired, with the slight tremor in the hands and the myopic squint of a man 20 years older than Holmes's 42, dressed in the worn respectable mode of a retired legal clerk. I heard the outer door open at precisely the agreed time of 7:30. The footsteps were firm and unhurried. There was a knock at the inner office door, and I pressed myself against the anteroom wall, watching through the crack of the unlatched door. She entered the office with the practised ease of a woman entirely in command of herself. She was perhaps 38, dark-haired, dressed in a deep green coat of good quality, carrying a small leather bag. She was, in every respect of appearance and bearing, a woman one might pass on any London street without a second glance. It was this quality, I suspected, the perfect ordinariness of her, that made her so effective. Mr. Ketch, she said. Her voice was pleasant and quite neutral. Mrs. Harlow, Holmes said, in an elderly quaver that was, I confess, entirely convincing. She sat in the offered chair and crossed her ankles with composed elegance. You have certain documents. I have certain documents, Holmes agreed. I have also... And here his voice changed, the quaver dissolving and the familiar precise cadence of Sherlock Holmes, replacing it with the completeness of a mask lifted. a considerable body of evidence regarding the murders of Aldous Pembridge and Bartholomew Finch. She did not move. For precisely 3 seconds she was entirely still, with the controlled stillness of a person absorbing a major shock without permitting it to reach the surface. Then she reached for her bag. "Watson," said Holmes. I came through the anteroom door with the revolver in my hand, and Lestrade was through the outer door 10 seconds later. She did not attempt to flee. She sat quite still, one hand in the bag, and looked at Holmes with an expression I found difficult to read. It was not defeat precisely, nor defiance. It was something closer to a very cold professional assessment. "Constance Margot Barr," Holmes said, "niece of Cornelius Barr, and I believe the person who administered the foxglove extract to Aldous Pembridge on the afternoon of November 14th. Chapter 11. The Unravelling of Every Thread. We were gathered the following morning in the Baker Street sitting room. Holmes, myself, Lestrade, and Inspector Munro, who had come down from Edinburgh on the overnight express when Lestrade wired him of the arrest. Outside, the November fog had settled with its customary authority, and Baker Street was reduced to its essentials: lamplight, the distant city, the comfortable particular silence of a warm room in cold weather. Mrs. Bias, Hudson had provided coffee and rolls, and Holmes, in his armchair in his grey dressing-gown, was in the reflective state that followed the resolution of a case. Not triumphant exactly, but engaged with the satisfaction of a craftsman surveying completed work. "I shall take it from the beginning," he said, refilling his coffee cup, "because I think Lestrade deserves the pleasure of understanding why his instinct about Clement Vane was simultaneously logical and mistaken. Lestrade, to his credit, received this with the equanimity of experience. I should like to understand it, yes. In 1879, Holmes began, the firm of Pembridge and Vane Associates conducted a survey of the Glendarroch estate, on instructions ultimately originating from the Earl of Brackendon's London solicitor, a man named Mortlake. The survey was falsified to show a boundary favourable to the Earl, incorporating a coal seam that properly belonged to the adjacent land. The 3 surveyors, Pembridge, Finch, and George Vane, were paid for their dishonesty and subsequently threatened into permanent silence. The matter rested there for 15 years, until 2 developments occurred in parallel. Lady Evelyn Forsyth's coal negotiations brought the boundary under commercial scrutiny, and Gideon Larch, her estate manager, quietly invested a large personal sum in the mining syndicate contracted to develop that coal. "Where did Larch get the capital?" Munro asked. "That is a question for the financial investigators, but I suspect he borrowed it heavily, pledging his future share of the mine's profits as security. He had access to the estate correspondence and was well placed to understand the value of the coal seam before it was public knowledge. He was, in a modest way, indulging in the same opportunism as the original fraud, only now the stakes were modern and commercial." Holmes set down his cup. When Lady Evelyn instructed her solicitor to contact Pembridge and Finch regarding a private settlement, Larch read those letters through the correspondence files and understood immediately that any formal acknowledgement of the fraud, even in the context of a private resolution, would require the testimony of the surviving surveyors, whose accounts would inevitably enter some form of legal record. The mining syndicate's investors, upon learning the title was contested, would withdraw. His investment would be worthless. He would be bankrupt. So he decided to remove the witnesses, Lestrade said. He enlisted his sister Marion Prentice, who lived in Edinburgh and was in financially reduced circumstances since her husband's death. He explained to her, I suspect, only as much as was necessary, that an old man named Finch possessed information dangerous to the estate, and that this information needed to be dealt with. Whether Marion Prentice understood she was participating in a plan to kill Finch, or whether she believed the poisoning to be something less lethal, I cannot say. She has not yet been found, and her own position before the law will depend considerably on what she understood herself to be doing. And the London half, I asked. Larch could not execute the London half personally. He had the plan, but not the access. Pembridge was a careful man who did not admit strangers, but someone else could reach him. Holmes paused. Cornelius Barr had known about the Glendarroch fraud since 1879, as a junior partner to Mortlake. He had spent 16 years keeping that secret with perfect success. When Lady Evelyn's solicitor's inquiries reached Barr's professional circles, as legal inquiries in a small world inevitably do, Barr understood that the secret might surface, and that if it did, his own role in the original suppression would come to light. He had made Mortlake's threat on behalf of the Earl. He had witnessed the additional payment. He was implicated. So Barr and Larch found each other, Munro said. I believe Larch approached Barr, perhaps through the mining syndicate's legal channel, where Barr's firm had connections, or perhaps more directly when the correspondence at Glendarroch revealed Barr's name in the old Mortlake files. Holmes rose and moved to the mantelpiece. They shared a motive and complemented each other's capabilities. Larch had the Edinburgh connection. Barr had the London access, specifically through his niece Constance, whom he had employed in a variety of sensitive tasks over several years, and who possessed, along with intelligence and a complete lack of scruple, a passing acquaintance with Pembridge's earlier professional life. He looked at Lestrade. She had met Pembridge on 2 occasions in the 1880s, in connection with some legal matters in which Barr's firm was involved. She was young then, and he had known her as Miss Barr. A pleasant girl, not memorable. She contacted him as an old acquaintance of sorts, using a different name, and he admitted her without suspicion. And she poisoned the port, Lestrade said. She poured his glass and then her own, introducing the tincture from a small vessel concealed in her bag as she reached forward across the table. Pembridge, looking perhaps into the fire or out the window, did not observe. She handed him his glass, declined her own, claiming some complaint of the digestion, and waited. He drank, she talked, and when the effects of the toxin began, perhaps 20 minutes later, she had already left the house. Holmes paused. She also retrieved the Glendarroch survey materials, which Barr wanted destroyed. The cut page from the survey ledger, the removed map. These were taken to remove the last physical record of the fraud, ensuring that even if the testimony of the surviving surveyors somehow failed to be suppressed, there would be no documentary corroboration. The room was quiet. Monroe had his notebook open, but had stopped writing, listening with the focused attention of a man filing information for future use. And Clement Vane, I asked, was never part of this. He had his father's memorandum, he had his grievance against Pembridge, and he had the misfortune of being in the Marylebone area on the day in question, visiting his solicitor on the adjacent street as subsequent inquiries confirmed. Constance Barr called upon him in the hope of purchasing the Vane memorandum before Lestrade's investigation led anyone to its existence. He declined. She did not move against him, which tells us something. She was not operating with unlimited license. She had a specific brief from Barr, Pembridge, Finch, the documents. Vane, who had chosen not to act on his information and posed no immediate threat, was left to one side. Holmes turned from the mantelpiece. It is possible she also judged that too many deaths in too short a time would provoke exactly the kind of coordinated investigation that has, in the event, brought her here. She misjudged, Lestrade said. She did, Holmes said with no particular inflection. They all did, in the end. Chapter 12. Barr's final calculation. The arrest of Cornelius Barr was carried out on the morning of November 24th, with the precision that Lestrade at his best was capable of, and the additional care that Holmes had insisted upon. Knowing that a man of Barr's legal sophistication would require an irresistible weight of evidence before any charge could be made to stick. The evidence, as Holmes had assembled it over the preceding days, was considerable. Clement Vane's testimony, Finch's sealed letter, the post-mortem confirmations from both cities, the testimony of Mrs. Craigie in Edinburgh regarding the woman with the parcel, the testimony of Clement Vane regarding Constance Barr's visit to his rooms, and the record of Barr's connection to the original Mortlake firm, and thence to the Glendarroch fraud. Constance Barr, in custody, had said nothing. She was a woman of formidable self-possession, and her first act upon arrest had been to instruct that she required a solicitor other than her uncle. The irony of this request was not lost on anyone present. Barr himself was taken at his chambers in Lincoln's Inn in the early morning, before his clerk arrived. Lestrade, who attended and reported the matter to us at Baker Street that afternoon, described the arrest with the contained satisfaction of a man delivering news he's earned. He was very calm, Lestrade said nothing at all, just looked at the warrant, looked at me, and called for his coat. A pause. He did say one thing, as we were going down the stairs. He said, "If the young woman says I was the principal, she is lying." I told him that she had said nothing of the kind, and he went very quiet indeed. He expected her to implicate him, Holmes said, and the realization that she had not unsettled him more than the arrest itself. He picked up his pipe. It tells us something about their relationship. He did not entirely trust her, and she understood that. She is protecting herself by maintaining silence, rather than by building a narrative that serves either of them. He paused. She's a dangerous woman and probably an intelligent one, and she will be a difficult witness to prosecute. But Barr's position is more exposed. His connection to Mortlake, the original suppression of the fraud, the nature of his instructions to Constance, the correspondence that I suspect exists somewhere between himself and Larch. These are angles that skilled prosecution will pursue. He may find that the silence he relied upon for 17 years has run its useful course. Gideon Larch was arrested at Hull on November 26th, attempting to take ship for Rotterdam. His sister Marion Prentice was found in Dundee 3 days later, staying with a cousin. Her circumstances, as Holmes had anticipated, were ambiguous. She had been told by her brother that Finch possessed certain documents that needed to be retrieved, and that the tea caddy was the means of incapacitating him temporarily while this was accomplished. Whether she understood incapacitation to mean death, or whether she had allowed herself not to understand, was a matter that the Crown's lawyers would spend considerable time examining. Lady Evelyn Forsyth, in the matter of the original fraud, occupied a position of considerable legal complexity. She had not known of the fraud during her father's lifetime, had discovered it through legitimate channels, and had taken steps, however imperfectly supervised, to address it privately. The land itself and its mineral rights were the subject of ongoing proceedings initiated by Duncan Halcrow, the heir of the original Halcrow estate, who had been advised of his rights by Holmes's communication through Monroe. Lady Evelyn, I was later informed, chose not to contest these rights, and reached a private settlement of considerable generosity, which spoke well of her character, if not of her estate managers. Holmes, when I mentioned this to him, made the short noise that served him for approval when he did not wish to commit to it openly. She was trapped by her inheritance, he said, as people frequently are. The question is always whether, once aware of the trap, one chooses to remain in it. Do you think she'll recover the estate financially? I asked. Without the coal seam? Possibly in time. She's a capable woman, and the estate's agricultural operations are sound. He looked into the fire. The Caledonian Coal and Mining Syndicate, without the Glenderrock title, has collapsed entirely. Mr. Thomas Aline of the city is, I understand, considerably out of pocket. Larch, of course, is bankrupt. One occasionally encounters a certain rough justice in the resolution of these things. He paused. The Halcrow nephew, on the other hand, has unexpectedly become a man of considerable mineral wealth, having spent his life as a schoolteacher in Melrose. I expect he will handle it with appropriate surprise. I smiled. And Clement Vane? Vane has the Glendarroch memorandum returned to him, which is now evidence in the Crown's case against Barr, and therefore temporarily beyond his commercial use. When proceedings conclude, however, it will be returned, and it represents a document of some historical and legal significance. Holmes picked up his violin. His father was a thief and a bully who threatened honest men into complicity, and spent the profits on lawyers rather than character. His son appears to be made of better material. He drew the bow across the strings in a slow, testing motion, listening for something only he could hear. That is something, I suppose. Chapter 13. Watson considers the geometry of evil. There is a conversation I have with myself on the evenings following the resolution of a case that I have never found an adequate way to conduct aloud. It concerns the difference between the crimes that Holmes investigates, which are, in their practical facts, the familiar vices of human nature arranged in unfamiliar configurations, and the sensation that those crimes produce in the observer who has followed them from beginning to end. I am a medical man, accustomed to the body's failings, familiar with the fact that life ends badly and often suddenly. I am not by nature a sentimental person, and yet the deaths of Aldous Pembridge and Bartholomew Finch stayed with me in a particular way. They were old men, both of them. They had done a dishonest thing, early in their lives, under pressure and for money, and they had carried the weight of it for 17 years in the way that most men carry their moral failures, quietly, privately, with the intermittent discomfort of a healed wound that aches in cold weather. Finch had written his letter of conscience, sealed it, and lived with it. Pembridge had entered into correspondence about a settlement that would finally, after all those years, make a degree of repair. They had not been villains. They had been, in their youth, weak men presented with a corrupt opportunity by a more powerful corrupt man, and they had taken it, and they had spent the rest of their lives being quietly ashamed. For this they were killed. Not by justice. They had been prepared, both of them in their different ways, to accept a form of justice. They were killed by the fear of others. Barr's fear of exposure, Larch's fear of financial ruin. Killed to protect a secret that had outlived the man who first created it and had now been weaponized in the service of greed in a new generation. I said something of this to Holmes the evening after Barr's arrest. Sitting by the fire with our coffee growing cold beside us, and the last of November pressing against the Baker Street windows with the quiet persistence of a season that intends to stay. The geometry of the thing troubles you, Holmes said. The proportion of it, I said. 2 lives taken. For coal. Not for Cole, Holmes said after a moment. For what Cole represents, which is the power to continue to be who one already is. Barr's life, his reputation, his standing, the whole careful architecture of a respectable legal career. Larch's financial ambition, which was not modest in its proportions. People do not kill for objects, Watson. They kill for identity. For the self they have constructed and cannot bear to lose. He stretched his long legs toward the fire. The fraud itself was originally committed for the same reason. The Earl wanted the seam not because he needed it, in any human sense of need, but because it was there and he wanted it, and he had the power to arrange for it to be his, and having it increased the magnitude of what he was. That is the thing that runs from 1879 to 1896 like a single wire. He paused. The original act of dishonesty contains all the subsequent ones, waiting to unfold. I thought about this. Outside, a cab went past, and the horse's hooves on the wet cobbles had the quality of absolute patience. "Do you believe that Constance Barr felt anything?" I asked. "About Pembridge? She sat with him. She talked with him. She watched him drink." Holmes was quiet for a long time. His face in the firelight was without its usual animation, simply a face, intelligent and tired. "I think she felt precisely nothing that she had not decided in advance to feel," he said at last. "She is a particular type. Not a monster exactly, but a person in whom the usual connective tissue between action and consequence has been severed, or was perhaps never strongly formed. She could sit with Pembridge and converse pleasantly, and watch him drink and feel, if she felt anything, only the professional satisfaction of a task correctly executed." He shifted in his chair. "I do not find such people less disturbing for understanding them. If anything, I find them more so." It was not a conclusion that invited comfortable response, and I did not offer one. We sat in the silence of men who have looked at a difficult thing together and agreed, without saying so, that looking at it was all they could do. Holmes picked up his violin eventually, and I recognised after a moment the passage he was playing. A slow, minor-key passage from one of the Bach partitas, music of the kind that seems to know something about loss without making a drama of it. Outside, London receded into its fog and its enormity. 10,000 rooms of hidden life, and Baker Street held its particular gravity around us. The fire and the lamplight and the smell of coal and tobacco, the comfortable weight of an old friendship conducting itself in easy silence. I thought of Finch with his sealed envelope, and his monthly tea and his Edinburgh winter, waiting with patient fear for something he could not prevent. I thought of Pembridge opening his door to a woman he half recognised, and calling her an old acquaintance, and pouring port into 2 glasses on an autumn afternoon. The last afternoon he would ever have. I thought of them as they had been in 1879. Not old men then, not afraid, simply 2 young surveyors on a misty border estate being offered something they should have refused and choosing not to refuse it. I thought of how long the consequences of a single choice can travel through a life, touching everything, invisible most of the time, until one November evening it arrives at the door in the shape of a pleasant dark-haired woman in London fashions and narrow-heeled boots. The Bach continued. The fire settled, and in Baker Street, in the fog, the world went about its business with the absolute indifference of a world that has seen everything before. Chapter 14. Holmes the morning after, and the next case. Waiting. It is a quality of Holmes that he grieved for nothing, or appeared to. I had seen him, in the aftermath of cases that had carried considerable human cost, return to his armchair and his chemistry experiments, and his violin with the same alert self-possession with which he took up everything, as if the emotional residue of a case was simply another category of evidence to be filed and set aside. I had long ago stopped interpreting this as coldness. It was, rather, the quality of a mind so genuinely and constantly occupied that it could not afford to dwell. To dwell was to stagnate. To stagnate for Holmes was a form of death that frightened him more than any external threat. He was up, dressed, and apparently cheerful by 6 o'clock on the morning of November 25th, when I descended to find him at his desk with a plate of buttered toast and the Morning Post arrayed before him, sorted by his own classification system into 3 piles. He was examining something in the second pile with an expression of moderate interest. "Lestrade has been thorough," he said, without looking up. "The evidence room contains the foxglove tincture vial found in Constance Barr's bag at the time of arrest, a glass vial of the sort used in homeopathic dispensaries, containing residue consistent with the lethal dose administered to Pembridge. This, combined with the testimony of Clement Vane, the post-mortem results, and the Edinburgh evidence, gives the prosecution a reasonable architecture, He set the paper down. Barr will engage counsel of distinction and attempt to argue that Constance acted independently. This will fail, because Constance's movements in the weeks prior to the murders can be shown to have been financed from a bank account that received regular transfers from an account connected, through one intermediary, to Barr's firm. He picked up his toast. Lestrade found this himself, actually. He is better than he is given credit for. I have always thought so, I said. You are generous in your assessments, Watson. It is both your greatest strength and your most characteristic intellectual habit. He smiled, genuinely, briefly. Sit down. Mrs. Hudson has left Kippers. We breakfasted in the companionable way of men who have been through something together and are not yet entirely sure what to do with the ordinary morning that follows. Holmes ate with actual appetite, which was unusual enough to remark upon. The Edinburgh business, he said, pouring coffee. Monroe handled the boundary of his jurisdiction well. The man thinks. He noticed the discrepancy in the post-mortem before he was asked to notice it. That is the foundation of good detective work. Not the extraordinary insight, but the refusal to accept the comfortable explanation when something is slightly wrong. He paused. I shall write him a letter. He would be gratified. He would be professionally satisfied, which in a Scottish policeman serves the same function. He picked up the third pile of letters, the ones he had classified, I could see, as requiring action. There are two matters here that will require attention in the next few days. One is a straightforward affair in Kensington, a missing will, and a nephew who believes he has been disinherited by fraud. The other, he held the letter up, examining it with slight curiosity, is more unusual. What is it? A letter from a director of the East India Docks Authority, regarding a ship that arrived from Calcutta 6 weeks ago, carrying a consignment of silk worth £8,000. The silk arrived. The merchant who purchased it was found dead of a snakebite in his Whitechapel warehouse 2 weeks later. Holmes tilted his head. The Dock Authority believes the snake was in the consignment. Scotland Yard believes the Dock Authority is being obstinate in order to avoid financial liability. He lowered the letter. Both positions, I suspect, contain some truth, and conceal something rather more interesting. A snakebite in Whitechapel, I said. In November. Quite. Holmes folded the letter and placed it in his inner pocket. Snakes do not generally travel to Whitechapel in November of their own volition, nor do they typically select wealthy silk merchants as their targets with such convenient specificity. He rose, and I observed the lift in his bearing, the slight straightening of the shoulders, the sharpening of the eyes, that told me his mind had already left the Glendarroch matter entirely and moved into the new problem with its characteristic eagerness. I shall wire the Dock Authority this morning and arrange to see the consignment records. He reached for his coat. You will not need your revolver today, I think, but bring your notebook. I stood and reached for my jacket, and the morning light came grey and clean through the Baker Street windows. And the city outside was fully underway, the cabs and the clerks and the 10,000 ordinary human urgencies of a London morning. And I experienced, as I had experienced so many times in that sitting room, the particular pleasure of standing at the beginning of a new problem with Holmes at my side, the sense that we were about to walk once more into the intricate, dangerous, endlessly interesting texture of the world. What do you make of it so far? I asked, pulling on my coat. The snake, the silk, the dead merchant. Holmes paused at the sitting-room door, his hat in his hand, his eyes already distant with the warm abstraction of a man whose mind is moving through possibilities at the speed of light. I make of it, he said, precisely enough to be certain that what I make of it at this stage is probably wrong. He put on his hat. Which, naturally, is the most interesting possible starting position. He opened the door. Come, Watson, the dock awaits, and the fog, I think, is lifting. We went down the stairs and out into Baker Street, and the November morning received us with its customary indifference, and we turned our faces east toward the river and the docks and the next puzzle waiting in the fog, and as I walked I found myself thinking, as I so often thought, and never tired of thinking, that whatever else might be said of the life I had chosen, in following this singular, brilliant, maddening man through the crooked passages of London's mysteries, it was never, not for a single morning, not for a single wet and foggy step, dull.